Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we will talk about the drain of wealth. In the earlier lecture on drain of wealth, we talked about that how India, because of the colonial policies of the British, was subjected to the economic exploitation. We talked about the ideas of economic nationalism, where such kind of a drain of wealth from India to Britain was criticized by some of the eminent scholars of those times, and these scholars they in a way pointed out that how this drain of wealth was detrimental to the health of the Indian economy. And when raw material finished products initially were going out of India, India was getting some kind of a bullion from the British. And thereafter, when they secured the revenues of India through the Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, we find that British, they stopped getting the bullion from Britain, and now they were making purchases from the revenue which they generated in India. And thereafter we also see when they expanded their control over India in terms of securing more and more areas for themselves, we find that British, they were fighting various kinds of wars, and all these wars they were seeking money from Indians as well. And apart from the kind of wars which were fought in India, we also find that they were fighting wars to expand their frontiers. They fought wars with Afghanistan, Burma, etc. And thereafter they secured those regions for themselves, and we find that Indian critics, in that sense, they realized the colonial policies, that how money was being taken out of India and it was contributing to the Indian impoverishment. So how we find that this kind of a drain was providing all sorts of economic and commercial gains to the British. And when Dadabhai Naoroji was talking about this drain theory, that how Indians, the kind of money which was being siphoned out of India, and this amounted to around 25% of the country's revenue, which was added to the resources of Britain, and how Indians, their interests, they were being ignored by the British, and it was some kind of a monstrous evil, as has been argued by Dadabhai Naoroji. And so how to stop this kind of a drain, it was also being talked about, and how the Indians, they also had to realize that this kind of a drain was going to destroy them in an economic manner. And so in this context, we find that these writings definitely played an important role in terms of disseminating those ideas, and how Indians, they became aware about such kind of a drain. And in that context, Dadabhai Naoroji's Poverty and Under British Rule in India in 1901, it was a significant milestone in the formulation of a nationalist political economy. And we also find that this kind of a poverty, which was visible to everyone, could be seen when India was left by the British as well. It was visible to everyone that British, they were in a way mutilated or exploited the Indian economy to such an extent that Indian economy was in a shred. We also realize that how when one talks about the British colonial policies or economic policies, some kind of ideas with regard to the British benevolence, they were being talked about, but we also realize that Indians in a way also realized that these kinds of ideas regarding the benevolence of the British rule or the British economic policies was some kind of a myth. And British, they were never benevolent in that sense in the context of Indians, rather they exploited them in every manner. And this kind of a criticism of the colonial rule for impoverishing the Indian economy was evident in the writings of many of the nationalists, including the moderate nationalists and thereafter the extremist nationalists as well. And how Indian National Congress took up this issue in different sessions, and they passed resolutions as well because of the miserable existence of the Indians, and various kinds of famines which took place in India, they were also being cited, and so many people, they died in millions at that point of time during these famines as well. And British, they were not concerned, though they appointed various kinds of commissions. But we find that despite appointing these commissions, not much could be done, and there was a continuity of famines in the 19th century and the 20th century. In the earlier part of the 20th century, and 19th century was a century of famines for the Indians, and we realized that in various sessions of the Congress and in various bodies, these kinds of ideas they were being talked about, that how India, though it was a rich country but had become poorer during the colonial period. And they also talked about the various kinds of aspects, that how this kind of poverty was growing in India, and it was some kind of a common national issue, and how Indians, they had to come and unite various sections of the society, all classes of the society, they should come and unite on this particular kind of a issue where their poverty was concerned. And we find that when Indians, they were talking with regard to the kind of data which was available to them, and when they pointed out that how Indian poverty was a major kind of a concern, then many times British officials, they were forced to in a way respond to these kinds of accusations, to these kinds of issues which were being raised by the Indians. And many times British, they in a way denied the existence of poverty, and they tried to point a rosy picture of the colonial rule. But when Indians, they talked about that how the exploitative character of the colonial regime and the functioning of the colonial government was oriented towards serving the interests of the British rather than India, and they also gave data with regard to that, then we find that these kinds of concerns, they were being highlighted. And we find that how the Indian industry was underdeveloped at that point of time, and the nationalists, they were of the firm opinion that India was going through a process of industrial underdevelopment under the colonial rule, and it was caused by two phenomena, both closely related to the colonial policies: a decline of India's indigenous industries and a failure to quickly develop the modern industry. So we find that how that indigenous industries, they were declining because of the colonial policies, and modern industries, they did not develop because British did not provide any kind of a support for the development of the Indian industries. And we find that it definitely played a big role in the poverty of the Indian people, because as jobs in one sector, they were lost, and they were not compensated by the rapid growth of the modern sector where modern industries could have been set up. So unemployment issue was another important issue of that at that point of time. And we find that before the arrival of the British, India was a great manufacturing country, and how it was exporting goods to Asia and Europe. And because of the arrival of the British, because of the policies of the British, we find that there was some kind of a reversal, and Indians, they were in a way forced to import clothes from Britain. And it was in a way seen as one of the saddest chapters in the history of British India, as has been argued by R.C. Dutt. And we find that how when Indian wealth was declining, employment opportunities were shrinking, then poverty was also increasing. And this kind of shrinking of the industrial employment led to great ruralization and intense pressure on agriculture, which itself was in a precarious situation. So all this in a way contributed to situations where Indians were becoming poorer and poorer. And at the same time, we do not find much avenues for education, not employment in the educational sector, because many of the higher posts in the administration, they were being reserved for the British. Indians were only given the lowly posts in the administration. We also realized that how British, they were using their political power to sell their cheaper machine made goods in India, leading to the destruction of the famous Indian handicrafts industry. When British products, they came to India, they were not imposed with heavy duties, rather none of the duties, they were being imposed on them. And then we find that the introduction of the railways also provided an opportunity to these products to reach the interior markets, because of which we find that the British cheaper machine made products, they could be sent to the interior regions of India through railways and other kinds of transport networks. And when one is talking about the abolition of tariffs, then we see that free trade in a way was imposed on India, this free trade was one way. When the British products, they were coming to India, they were not paying any duties. And we also see that the railways definitely helped them in this endeavor, where they were able to send those products to the interior regions, and we also realize that the kind of other economic policies which were followed by the British led to very slow development of the modern industries in India. And the people, those who realized such kind of policies by the British, they criticized the colonial government for this, and they asked that the abolition of the tariff the doubly hindered the growth, and by allowing the cheap foreign goods to invade countries' markets, and by decreasing the revenue collection of government, which would then be compensated either by more internal extraction or low public expenditure. So, Indians, they were losing in every way. When the government will earn less, then definitely then it will also spend less on the public expenditure, and rather they would also focus on more internal extraction of the taxes. That was another kind of a concern. So, Indians would be losers in that sense in every way because of the colonial policies, and the nationalists, they in a way demanded that the policies that obstructed the growth of Indian industries, they should be removed, and emphasis should be laid on the speedy industrialization of the country. And they also demanded the creation of a suitable tariff regime that would help the growth of the Indian industries by restricting the entry of cheaper machine made goods from the industrialized countries. So, they realized the perils of this kind of import of the cheaper products, and they wanted that some kind of rectifying measures they should be taken, so that Indian situation could be improved. And we also in a way realized that this such kind of a criticism of the colonial public finance related to both its aspects, that how much revenue was collected and how it was spent, was another important concern of that particular period. And we realized that the financial policies of the colonial government in a way received great attention from the nationalists because of its effects, disastrous effects on the resources of the country. And when we realized that the nationalists, especially the people, those who realized the economic policies, those who were reading about the economic policies, those who were in a way economists themselves from their own understanding, they were in a way critical of the taxation policies of the colonial government, which claimed that taxes in India were quite light, and it was argued by the government officials that revenues from land, toddy and opium were not taxes, thus making tax regime appear light. So, the government officials took all sorts of routes in that sense, that in a way they argued that the kind of money which they were earning from land, toddy and opium, they were not seen as taxes by them. So, their tax regime was made to appear lighter, which it was not, because whether see it in the framework of the land revenue settlements, we find that they were claiming nearly 50% of the land revenue as their share. And in the context of other taxes as well, the tax regime was very rigid and stringent, and the collection was also very strict in that sense. So, we find that how the critics of the government, they argued that the all collections by the government from the total annual income of the country should be considered as some kind of a form of tax, and they in a way rejected the government claims that India was lightly taxed, and contended that tax burden was huge and it was reaching its limits. And many of the scholars like Ranade, he stated in 1880 that any further increase of taxation must be adjured as political insanity, and Nauroji also bitterly remarked that colonial rulers were screwing out more and more taxes, like squeezing and squeezed orange, inflicting suffering and distress. So, we find that how these people, those who were talking about the taxation system in India, how they were talking about that how these taxes, they were higher in the context of the Indians, and it was very low when they were when the British imported the Indian products. We realized that they were taxed very heavily, and on the other hand we see that when the British products they came to India, either they were not taxed, or if they were taxed, then they were taxed very lightly. And we also realized that how the nationalists, they contended that the burden of taxation should be seen in relation to the wealth of the country and the earnings of the people. And in the Indian context, we find that most of the Indians, they were not earning because of the unemployment in India during the colonial period, or the kind of no thrust on the agricultural as well as the industrial policy in India. And we also find that one of the important concern was the amount of the taxes was very high, and the British, the way they spent the kind of money which they collected as taxes. So the expenditure part was also very important. We find that a large part of the tax collection was taken out of the country and it was not spent inside. So it was a big drain of the resources of India when British, they took away so much wealth through various means out of India. And Nauroji in a way argued that it is not the incidence of taxes that is India's evil. Evil is the drain of portion of revenue out of the country. And he also argued that moreover it is the use, the way the money was being used on the military wars with India's neighbors, railways and various unproductive and wasteful activities. So that was one of the important concerns of the people. They realized that how British, they were spending that money, and this money was being utilized in the various kinds of wars which were fought by the British to expand their frontiers, and then to in a way exploit those regions as well. And Indian nationalists, we find that, like Gopal Krishna Gokhale argued in 1897, that the utility of the taxation in any country was decided by the purposes for which increase has been incurred and the result produced by such outlay of public money. And these scholars like Gokhale, they asserted constantly increasing taxation and its irrational expenditure under the autocratic management, effective constitutional control and inherent defects of the alien domination. And it not only helped to bring about constantly increasing exploitation of our resources, has retarded our material progress, weakened our national defenses and burdened us with undefined and indefinite financial liabilities. So this is what he argued, and we find that how during that particular period people were dependent on agriculture, and how 80% of the population was dependent on agricultural practices, and the revenue from the land was one of the most important constituents of the government collection in the 19th century. And we find that the land revenue demand definitely was very high, and it was strictly collected, resulting in the growing impoverishment of the peasantry. So these aspects made India poor, because we find that British, they were engaged in a strict collection of the land revenue, and for that we find that they initiated various kinds of land revenue settlements as well. And through these land revenue settlements, they were not only ensuring higher land revenue for themselves, but at the same time we also realize that they were not caring about the Indians in that context, and how the nationalists picked up these issues, and they insisted that it was one of the main causes of the recurrent famines and the poverty of India and the decline of the agriculture as well. And R.C. Dutt developed it into a consistent campaign as well. And we find that they talked about, or they objected to certain concerns, for example the high pitch of land revenue, which took a large portion of agricultural savings, draining the capital away from India, hindering the investment in agriculture, pauperizing the countryside and creating the regular famines. So there was some kind of a chain in that sense. When the land revenue was high, then we find that British, they were taking the high portion of the agricultural savings and the kind of capital which was being drained from India. And we also realize that at this point of time country became more and more poorer because of these kinds of practices by the British, and it resulted in various kinds of famines during that particular period, when we realized that Indians, they did not have resources to sustain themselves. We also find that the British, they were revising their land revenue collection at different points of time, the way they were assessing the revenue, and this also created some kind of an uncertainty at that point of time. And many a times we realized that the cultivators, they were being dissuaded to invest in the land, leading to stagnation and decay in agriculture. So, such kind of policies definitely were detrimental to Indian agriculture, on which so many people depended, and this kind of a raise in the revenue demands by the government, it encouraged the landlords also to raise it even more in their areas, and this was detrimental to the interests of the farmers, because we realized that not much money was invested in the land, so that the agricultural productivity increases or the production increases. And such kind of a collection, which was strict in nature, of the rents, the revenue from the peasants, it was also accompanied by the evictions and the punishment. So, we realized that British, they in a way not only collected the rents and revenue in a strict manner, but they also evicted or punished the peasants as well. And we also realized that the law courts also favored the people, those who had money, and the peasants, they were not aware about the law system, and even if they were, they did not have money to go to the law courts. And we find that all these kinds of policies in a way contributed to the drain of the capital out of India. In terms of agricultural capital was also drained out of India, and we find that not money was not invested in the land, and over a period of time, when one will not invest money in the land, the quality of the land definitely is going to deteriorate, and the agricultural population will become poorer. And we also find that the recurrence of famine was an important concern of that particular period as well. So, some kind of measures, they were being suggested by the nationalists, that how should the land revenue should be decreased by the government, that the peasant should have some kind of a surplus to tide over the adverse weather conditions, and the mode of collection should also be made more flexible in that sense, and some kind of a permanent tenure should also be fixed in all the regions. So, these were some of the demands which were being made by the nationalists at this point of a time. And when they were talking about some kind of a permanent settlement, they did not necessarily mean that they were asking for a Bengal type zamindari settlement all over India. Rather, in many cases, what they were demanding was a long term fixation of tenure, under which peasants would be assured that they had to pay a certain revenue for a long time, and that their lands would not be confiscated. So, we find that nationalists, they were very well aware, and they distinguished between the Bengal type settlement and a fixed government demand under all type of settlement, and it was attested by them in their numerous writings as well. Their appeal to government was to fix revenue for a long time, so that peasants might benefit and surplus would be invested for the improvement of the land. But government was not in a way willing to concede to these kinds of demand, because their main concern was to secure more and more revenue for themselves. And we find that in other areas as well. For example, foreign trade, the colonial takeover resulted in an enormous increase. Both the imports as well as the exports, they expanded, and the nature of trade underwent significant changes as well. And we find that until 1813, India had been primarily an exporter of the manufactured goods, particularly cotton and the silk textiles, and an importer of precious metals such as gold and silver. So, we find that how over a period of time, because of the colonial policies, over a period of time, we find that India lost a lot of wealth, a lot of money, which was being drained out of India because of the colonial policies. And we find that India, which was earlier exporting the finished products, was now exporting the raw materials, and it became the importer of the manufactured goods. So, this kind of a change or role reversal was detrimental to the Indian economy, and another feature of the India's trade became an excess in value of exports over the value of imports. And we find that how the nationalists, they contested the optimistic view of the colonial administration that the growth of trade was good for India, and they argued that the volume of trade in India in itself could not be taken as an indicator of prosperity of a country without taking into account its context and its nature. So, they in a way rejected that this kind of export of the primary products or the raw material was beneficial to the Indians, and even if the trade volume was large, it did not mean that Indians, they were gaining anything out of it, and whatever finished products they were coming to India, then they were detrimental to the colonial, to the health of the Indian economy, and they were also in a way trying to convey the de-industrialized status of the Indian industry, that when Indians, they were exporting the raw materials and now they were not exporting the finished products. So, the favorable balance of trade was in the favor of the British, and even if Indian exports were more, they were only in the primary products, and it was not to the benefit of the Indians, and whatever foreign charges, foreign exchange which was coming to India was comparatively less in that sense. And we also find that how the home charges, etc., they were also being paid out of the Indian exchequer, and the various salaries and earnings of the British in India, they were also remitted to the British in the British currency to the British, and in this way we find the trade earnings of India, they also benefited the British. And R.C. Dutt has argued that the economic drain from India for home charges compelled that country to export more than she could import, and this excess was forced and maintained even during the times of famine as well, when country itself needed food grains. So, we find that this idea of economic nationalism was important in that sense, and it emerged in India out of the ideological contestation between the colonial government officials and the early nationalists. And we realized that it was also as a result of the colonial policies, where we find that colonial policies led to such kind of a situation that they realized that Indians, they were being impoverished because of the colonial policies. And when we in a way try to see that how British rule was economically injurious to India and the way it was being designed. So, when we talk about the ideas of drain of wealth, we realize that some kind of a proper national economic policy would definitely serve the Indian interests, and these nationalists, they realized as well. They talked about in the later part about the economic policy, and they wished that India should be on the modern industrial development path, and for this they raised these kinds of concern. And their contribution in that sense could be seen in the framework that how Indian people, they were made to realize about the bond of the common economic interests, and how they were also talking about the existence of the common enemy, that was British, and how it would also help them to weld them in a common nationalism. So, with this I would like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.